Hey, what's going on guys? Welcome back to the channel and another video. In this week's video, we'll take a look at how I turned this maple slab, which I considered purchasing a mistake, into these beautiful solid maple cutting boards. And for the first time ever, I have a link to these products on my brand new Etsy page, which you can see here. And I've also partnered with a company that offers extremely affordable cutting boards and other products, but more on that later. Let's go ahead and get started with this video. So a while back, I finally found a local sawmill that cut and offered live edge slabs for sale, and I may have got a little overexcited by buying way more live edge slabs than I knew what to do with. My original plan was to make a ton of live edge coffee tables that would sell so fast and be in such high demand in my area that I wouldn't know what to do and would become a millionaire overnight. But after my very first live edge coffee table didn't sell quite as fast or for as much as I wanted it to, turns out that I had a lot of these live edge slabs left over, and this maple slab had been in the way for way too long, so it was time to finally do something with it. If you follow along on my channel, you may have seen a couple videos back where I took some scrap leftover walnut pieces from a giant live edge table I made and made the very first cutting board I've ever built, which was actually a really enjoyable process. So I decided to do the exact same thing with this entire slab of maple. So when building cutting boards from a live edge slab, the first thing that you will need to do is to break the slab down into workable pieces. A couple of those previous shots, you can see that this slab was warped across the middle of the slab. So cutting this thing up into multiple pieces will not only allow us to work with these pieces much easier, but also preserve the thickness of the slab, as my goal with these cutting boards is to keep them as thick as possible. After the slabs are cut up, our first step will be to face plane one side on the joiner. If it wasn't obvious enough, some of these pieces were a little too big to fit on the joiner, so I used the table saw to cut that live edge off. Technically, the live edge is completely useless as far as putting these on a cutting board, because we want our cutting boards to be as straight as possible. But anyway, the milling process of these pieces is the exact same as a typical milling process for any stock whatsoever. You face joint one side, plane the opposite face, take one edge through the joiner, and then head over to the table saw and rip the pieces to whatever width you need. So here is a look at the slab after I sliced him up into workable pieces. And in the beginning of the video, you may have noticed that there were two slabs rather than one. So I did the exact same thing with the other slab that you didn't see and ended up with a ton of these pieces of maple. Most of them are about 2 inches thick by 24-25 inches long, and then just random widths. Maple is a wood that I haven't worked a lot with before, and I was extremely impressed by some of the figure on these pieces. And at this point I had high hopes for how awesome these cutting boards were going to turn out. Cutting boards are often made up of smaller wood strips glued together to create a cool pattern, and one thing I noticed when I was cutting these apart was that I liked the look of the edge grain opposed to the face grain. So after cutting the pieces, I would rotate them 90 degrees one way or the other to reveal that nice edge grain and give me the best look I could across the entire board with the figure. Here is the first board that I came up with, and with that one complete, I only had this huge stack of maple left to see how many other boards I could make from these slabs. So the rest of the boards are ripped to a width somewhere around 1.5 inches, although I did make some smaller strips just to mix everything up a bit as well. The cool thing about making cutting boards is that you can rearrange the strips however you want. There's really no specific order or certain way that you have to glue the strips together. You just rearrange the strips to whatever you think looks best, and then from there it's just a normal glue up. I was aiming to keep the width of these boards under 20 inches so I'd be able to fit them through my planer. However, if you don't have a planer that can accept wider material like these cutting boards, you may want to take some extra time to clean up the glue off both of the surfaces and make sure that all of your boards are lined up perfectly. But if you're looking for a reason to justify purchasing a wider planer, if you build a lot of cutting boards, this will save you a ton of time and give you a lot more functionality with the wider planer, rather than having to surface these with a sander or a router sled. After both sides are surfaced with the planer, we'll grab the crosscut sled and we will square up the edges, making this thing look like an actual rectangular or square board rather than just a bunch of pieces glued together. Surprisingly, I was able to get 6 cutting boards out of this entire slab. And at this point, I was a bit shocked by how awesome these cutting boards looked. So all kinds of figure across the surfaces, some curl, a lot of spalting, dark figure and light figure. These boards at this stage look awesome and I couldn't wait to get them finished up. So our next step is to take these rectangular blocks and make them into more of a cutting board. So we'll take a round over bit and we will round over each edge. You can do that on a router table, or if you don't have a router table, you can do the same thing with just a palm router and a round over bit going across all the edges of the cutting board. With all of the edges finished up, we'll switch the router bit to a round nose bit and add a juice groove. So I'm doing this upside down on the router table, which did work, but was a bit hard to maintain a clean and crisp line, obviously, as I'm doing this upside down. So a much easier way to do these juice grooves will to use a right angle jig, which basically lets the router track the outside of the cutting board, but cuts on a slight offset inward on the cutting board, which I've found to be an easier method than using the router table. Next up will be to sand these boards down, and the easiest way to do this is to use a drum sander if you have one. If you do not have a drum sander, you can do the same exact thing with the hand sander, but the drum sander will make sure that we get a flat surface, which is why I made that chalk line across the top. After the first pass of sanding, I like to wider pop the grain, which will help those wood fibers swell up. Then we'll sand them down again to make sure that whenever these boards are washed, there won't be any surprises or swelling from the grain. So at this point, if you think it is too much work to build these cutting boards, or custom handmade cutting boards are not exactly budget friendly, I decided to partner with the brand of Royal Craft Wood to showcase some extremely affordable cutting board options. These are bamboo cutting boards. You can cut pineapple on them. If you don't like pineapple, you can cut green peppers. And if you don't like green peppers, you can even cut onions. Regardless of whatever you're cutting, cleanup is easy with just soap and water. And the brand also offers some other products, such as the cutting board holder, drawer organizers that can take your drawers looking from this to this, as well as also a variety of different products. So be sure to check them out. I'll leave a link in the description to their products. And now let's get back to the maple cutting boards. So we've sanded these boards down, water popped them, and sanded them a second time, but I wanted to take it up one more level, so I turned these boards upside down, grabbed a cove bit in my palm router, and slowly cut handles out on each side of this. While certainly not necessary when building cutting boards, adding these handles on the other side are somewhat like the juice groove on the top side, which is just an extra element of detail you can add to make your cutting boards look that much better. Before we put the finish oil and wax on these, we need to give them one final sanding coat. I like to sand all of the edges down with either 150 or 180 grit sandpaper to make sure I didn't miss any edges and that everything has been sanded multiple times. The adapter pad for those soft edges is an absolute game changer when using a sander. Unfortunately, you have to sand some of the pieces down by hand, such as those juice grooves and the handles on the other side. But once we have everything sanded down, we can finally move on to the oil and wax phase of finishing these boards. Putting oil on a wood product is by far the easiest finish possible because you can't really mess it up like you can stain or paint or any type of clear coat finish. Additionally, it's extremely satisfying to watch that oil soak in the wood, and the color and the grain finally comes to life. You can certainly apply multiple coats of oil if needed, but once those boards are finally dry, maybe 24 hours or so later, I like to go back and buff on a wax finish. The wax and the oil should always be food safe. I'd recommend a natural type of mineral oil, and to stay away from motor oils because you probably shouldn't eat or ingest something that goes in your car. Anyway, the very last step for these boards was just to add some feet on the underside. The feet will elevate the board up off of the table and allow for airflow, but also give them a nice stance. With all that finished up, here are some final pictures of how the cutting boards turned out. In my opinion, these turned out great, and like I mentioned earlier, these are now available for purchase on my Etsy website. So if you made it this far, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Be sure to leave a comment and let me know what you think or how these boards turned out. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you in the next video.